Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining this learning session on forest. This is the first of the series of session for the forest governance and tenure rights. So we welcome you to this just an informal learning session for this afternoon, and thank you for joining. In the Philippines, especially, it's a holiday, so we thank our colleagues from the Philippines for joining. So just to share the brief objective of the session today. So this is the first part of the two-part of the learning session on FPIC and Safeguards. But for this afternoon session, it's more focused on the fundamentals of FPIC, of our pre-prior and informed consent. We wanted to have at the end of the session to level up our understanding and knowledge on the fundamentals of FPIC and identify existing challenges and barriers to FPIC implementation, and to learn from the experience of other countries on implementing FPIC. But just some reminders before we should officially begin. So we are requesting everyone to rename your screen name in Zoom, to put your participant, the dash and name and dash your organization. We will not have any translation for this session, so we will be using English as our main language. There will be a question and answer portion at the end of Attorney Edna's presentation. So if you wish to ask a question, please just click the raise hand function in the Zoom, or you can also put it in the chat while Attorney Edna is presenting. For any questions or other technical issues, you can send a private message to our technical team, Martin or the NTFP-EP Hive. Yeah, for any questions on technical difficulties, among others. So just to go straight to the session, let me introduce our Executive Director, Ms. Femi Pinto. Ms. Femi has almost 3 decades of experience, combination of work in the field with indigenous and local grassroots communities in the Philippines, Mekong countries, and the ASEAN region, management in NGOs, and convening regional multi-stakeholder network around forest and natural resources management and governance. She's currently in the supervisory board of the Green Livelihoods Alliance, one of our partner in organizing this learning session. It's a global alliance of 6 international organizations located in the Netherlands, Latin America, and Africa, with NTFP-EP Asia representing Asia. The alliance aims to ensure that the tropical forests and forest landscapes are sustainably and inclusively governed to mitigate and adapt to climate change, fulfill human rights, and safeguard local livelihoods. Together with the Mekong Regional Land Governance, or MRLG, GLA supports this learning initiative and this learning session today. So, Ms. Femi, the virtual floor is yours.
Okay, so good afternoon again, and greetings of peace and celebration. We're not a big group, but I know from Dazzle that the plan is that this will be recorded. So especially for the Filipinos who are on holiday, it will allow the others to also pick up what we learned today through the recording. So good afternoon again, and greetings of peace and celebration. As Dazzle said, here in the Philippines, we are celebrating the 36th anniversary of the EDSA People Power Revolution. While we celebrate, we continue to keep a collective aspiration. And for me, I like prayers and hope for peace and nonviolence. We have more recent news of conflict in Ukraine, and in our region, Myanmar struggles are still persisting. But we are here, for some of us on holiday, still coming to join for this session, I guess, with a keen interest to learn and contribute on our topic for today. As Dazzle had mentioned, this is the first in a series of learning sessions to support our regional collaboration, particularly around forest governance and tenure rights. Many of us have already been in partnership in close collaboration regionally for engagements at the ASEAN to elevate our voices from elevate our own CSO voice, but also the voices from the ground, the voices from the indigenous peoples and local communities, or them, or maybe even bringing them to these platforms. Bringing also the issues that we see that persist on the ground and our collective recommendations. As far as forest governance, customary tenure, FPIC, and safeguards are concerned, we know that there's been slow increments of tenure handed over to communities. Globally, still, we had heard in our previous dialogue events and learning events, some of our allies have mentioned that through research that globally still there are only still around 70% of forest lands that remain not in community hands, but in government or private hands. There are national laws, regulations, and policies that do recognize customary tenure of communities, but often these are not yet fully aligned to the actual land use or practices on the ground because they give only portions on the areas and limited and restricted rights to indigenous and local communities, especially customary rights over land, resources, water, and other ecosystem services that abound from community managed and protected forest landscapes. On representation, there is still a lack of inclusive representation of the communities in the decision-making bodies in forestry, agriculture, and food security. And related to that lack of representation, we see that since representation is limited, representation to raise grievances and concerns bear lots of challenges, and sometimes they are not being heard and responded to. Cases of encroachments in customary land and forest threaten customary rights and impede traditional livelihoods, and also their customary conservation and resource management practices. Even in government-supported investments, where there is application of EIAs, yes, they are technically complied, but lacking or absent in assessment of sociocultural impacts and considerations. Community plans and priorities are not taken into consideration during development and implementation of such projects. The right to provide or withhold consent is not respected or upheld. The right to actually say yes or no, or the right to define the condition of the benefit sharing arrangement is missing. Large-scale land acquisitions persist. We've heard that from research from our partners. They happen very fast and sometimes even in a context of pressures and conflict. Yes, we recognize the strength of legislation, but at the same time, we also have some of our respected CSO leaders expressing about the importance of following a moral code and the essentials of respect for inherent rights, one of self-determination, and with it the right to practice indigenous knowledge, systems, and practice, and these be respected. In the context of FPIC that we will discuss today and we will learn more about, this is an important principle. So how do we ensure that rights and safeguards are respected and enforced? What will it take to invoke full respect and fulfillment of these rights and safeguards? As this learning session is more internal to us, our network, and it's set within our alliance, well, my hope is that we could harness and strengthen our strategies in our engagement and advocacies from local, national, regional, and perhaps even globally, as we are also now in a global alliance, that we could certainly treat this as an opportunity. So hopefully learning sessions like this can really push us more into the area of sharpening our strategies as we learn more about the intricacies of these principles. How do we integrate that and apply what we know by having sharper strategies in the context of limited or maybe even very open policy and very comprehensive and policy-rich environment. So I do encourage all of us to learn, but at the same time in our coming discussions and coming network meetings, that we also bring these learnings into our thinking, our strategic thinking, and kind of sharpening our work and collaborations moving forward. So I am also encouraged that since we are having this learning session amongst different networks, but in some cases they are now converging with each other and we're now synergizing our strategies. It's really encouraging to see that. And hopefully that strengthens us even further. So looking forward to the session today. Thank you, Attorney Edna, for coming here, for being here, and sharing also your expertise with us. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms.
Back to
Fami,
you, Dazzle.
joining us this afternoon and for that very inspiring opening message, and for especially for pointing out to the hope to harness and improve our strategies, particularly on FPIC, and hopefully to sharpen with the learning session can help us sharpen our strategies and in the context of either open or limited policy opportunities, policy development opportunities. So now let me introduce to you our resource speaker for this afternoon learning session, Attorney Edna Magigat. Attorney Edna is the NTFP's regional researcher for CT for customary tenure and FPIC. She is a public interest lawyer who has worked with marginalized sectors and local governments on access to justice issues for almost 20 years, 10 years of which was focused on climate change, forests, biodiversity, and indigenous peoples at both the national, ASEAN, and global level. She has worked with many prestigious organizations, UNDP, FAO, GIZ, World Bank, and GOP, DNR. She also taught environmental law and agrarian reform law in 3 Metro Manila universities, building policy and legal framework around biodiversity-friendly community forestry enterprises, RED+, and bioprospecting under Nagoya Protocol, and operationalizing them are some of her favorite and specialist work areas. She is now also currently the project lead for Community Conservation and Natural Climate Solutions Project in Palawan, Philippines, for Conservation in International Philippines. Ms. Edna Silakan, please, the virtual floor is yours.
Hello everyone. Good afternoon, Dazzle. I'm so glad to be back in this room of colleagues that I worked with in the past few years, a decade. So we will talk about a very interesting topic because this has been a subject of much concern in the past years. Personally, I've been involved in a number of FPIC processes, major ones, small ones, at the ground level, and even up to like supporting on policy development of FPIC, particularly in the Philippines. So this is a familiar room, and I see a lot of colleagues who have more experience in their country context. So let us make this fun and more of like sharing and something that we can put forward in terms of having like what are concrete things that the network, various networks in here can put forward not only as recommendation, but really concrete actions, both at the ground level as well as from the policy side. So this morning I was busy on an FPIC issue, so this is very timely. Anyway, I will share my screen. Please enable me to share my screen, please. Okay. Hello. Okay. Hello. Hello. You can I share my screen? Okay.
Yes, Ms. Edna, you can.
Sorry. Okay, here we go. But before that, I want to have like a quick round of introductions from our colleagues in this room. we have plenty of time. I have 1 hour to discuss a topic that we are passionate about, and I'm sure we can learn from each other. Maybe a quick round of how are you and introductions. Nobody wants to do that.
I think it's okay. Yeah, we can.
No,
We
yeah.
can.
So I see Point. I see Olivia from NTFP. I see our colleagues from Pan Nature. Is that true? So just say hi.
Hi.
Maybe you can turn off your
Turn on.
Turn on.
your, sorry, turn off your screen share first, Miss Edna, if you want. If you
Oh
want.
yeah, yeah.
For the gallery.
Marilyn,
Yeah.
okay, sige, sige.
Yes.
So we do a gallery hi and hello to everyone here. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, it's been a
Hello,
while.
hello.
You can turn if it's you can also turn on your video if the internet connection is
Muja's
much
here.
better. I see Ate Olive, Ma'am Chai, Ruth, Shiringan, John Marie Ferraris from LRC. Thank you for joining. Nicholas, hello.
Hi, Muja.
Oh, I see
Rome
True
of
and then
Nature.
Chai.
So we're coming from different.
Say hi because we are recorded and we will share this to our colleagues.
Yes.
They will see
My
us in
team,
a
thanks for
later
joining.
time. So
Oh, so I have to be very careful of what I say when I say a bad case of FPIC. So this should be taken against me, but I was asked to share a bad case of FPIC.
Maybe
Anyway,
challenging.
yeah, it will be challenging to be very diplomatic and make sure no cases will be filed against me. Okay, let's start now.
okay.
So, given that, of course, this is a familiar room with all of us having experience going into a consent process with the community, but let us first situate what is FPIC. What is FPIC? Its concept and origins, and including international and regional and policy origins. And so let's begin first, of course, with the ILO Convention 1989. So then the ILO Convention 1989 is, think, the first one, a policy document that expressly provides that indigenous people must be consulted whenever consideration is being given to legislative or administrative measures which may affect them directly, and that consultation shall be undertaken in good faith and in a form appropriate to the circumstance, with the objective of achieving agreement or consent. But the ILO Convention 1989, of course, before that would be decades of extensive work from various organizations, indigenous peoples group, that could be traced back from cases on native title doctrine in 1900, and struggles of indigenous people to be recognized in their own countries. So the first major, let's say, policy document is the ILO 169, and some of the countries in ASEAN are not part of this. Even the Philippines have not signed this law. The second one is Article 8J of the UN CBD, or the Convention of Biological Diversity in 1992. It is very important, particularly for our work, because it refers to traditional knowledge, genetic resources, and access to traditional knowledge, innovation, and practices. So if you're familiar with the UNCBD language, we call it like the KIP, so it requires that this particular treaty affirms the principle of FPIC by saying that states, when accessing traditional knowledge, innovations, and practices of indigenous and local communities, shall be subject to prior informed consent or prior informed approval from the holders of such knowledge, innovation, and practices. And so that was 1992. And it is very important because at that time, there is no such um, what I call this treaty on that magnitude, because this is 190 plus country, part of the Rio Convention, the 3 treaties. So there is no such treaty that has like extensive membership. And it is also very important as more decision and more international guidance and protocols were agreed by country parties at the UNCBD. One is the Nagoya Protocol, which is one of my favorite treaty because it's also wealth creation. So it looks at how development for bioprospecting for indigenous people and non-indigenous people can prosper in a country, and PIC, the prior informed consent, or in our country called it FPIC, for indigenous people, and also PIC for non-indigenous people, is very important. Okay. And then next, that you have all these human rights treaties, particularly operationalizing human rights-based approaches to development. We have this in 2003, you have the UN Common Understanding on the Human Rights-Based Approach to Development Cooperation. This is where we get the idea of the rights-based development, where there is an understanding of the essential role of development cooperation in supporting the capacity of duty bearers meaning the states, to meet the obligation of the rights holders, and the rights holders are communities, different stakeholders as defined in the different treaties. So here, the rights and obligation of state to consult with indigenous people and forest-dependent communities with a view of having an agreement was the first, I think, where the requirement to obtain FPIC of indigenous people is also can be traced. And there's a growing call to secure consent, not only particularly for forest-dependent communities. And by that time, so this was in around early 2000, there is already the Philippines Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act. This is the first of its kind in the region in terms of elevating the practice of FPIC, not only as a moral obligation of someone going into a house or the territory of another group of person, but making it a legal right, a statutory right, where if there is violation, then there is a redress process of having, for example, filing cases, and or the government or the indigenous people can just have a cease and desist order for that proponent, whether that proponent is private or government. And then maybe we can talk about, IPRA as example at the end of the presentation. And you have, of course, UNDRIP in 2007. And so IPRA was before UNDRIP, and UNDRIP 2007 is very important because it is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and FPIC is enshrined there. And then part of the development at the UNFCCC process, particularly how governments and NGOs supporting REDD+ development in developing countries would make sure that this REDD+ development are actually not are addressing so REDD+ development, particularly the eligible activities for REDD+, are actually implemented in a way wherein the different Cancun safeguards are observed throughout its implementation. And one of the Cancun safeguard is the full and effective participation of indigenous people. Cancun safeguard is very important in terms of FPIC development in ASEAN because you have Myanmar, you have Vietnam, and you have Cambodia, who are UN REDD supported countries who have started FPIC piloting and development of FPIC guidelines because of this RED Plus obligation by the country. And under the 2030 agenda, you have 73 out of the 169 targets. They have substantial links to the UNDRIP. Okay. So at the regional level, you have, in terms of policy development, there is no really what you can say like, as of now, a concrete a policy specifically on FPIC, but we have several documents that by itself are can be considered as policy framework where FPIC can springboard into a number of important actions. Pag sinabi when we say about actions for FPIC, maybe at the national level, there will be more discussion on FPIC, maybe more attempt to develop national level guidelines, or even simple operational 1, 2, 3 of how an FPIC process can be, given that it's kind of very challenging to have a regional guidelines on FPIC without first looking into the different country context. And it will be good that at the country context, based from their learnings and experiences of early FPIC implementation, this will be elevated at the regional level to have really a more informed regional policy. So if you look at the development of FPIC, it can be looked in terms of the development of customary tenure recognition, social forestry support, and even promotion of ICCAs. So in 2015, the social forestry group, we call it the ASEAN Working Group on Social Forestry. So this is a working group at the ASEAN level composed of the heads of the social forestry division or offices of the different ASEAN countries. And they have been discussing FPIC since 2012. And this discussion stems from the CSO Forum on Social Forestry push and agenda on making sure rights of FPIC within social forestry, within climate change, are actually observed, documented, and throughout the region. So here are some of their policy statement with regards to FPIC. And okay, so what was really kind of challenging with this policy pronouncement, because these are just general policy pronouncement, it does not address certain ambiguity of the FPIC as a principle, FPIC as a concept, and FPIC as a process. So there are mixed understanding. Me as a FPIC practitioner, I would call myself an FPIC practitioner because I will ensure that any development or project design that my clients like government and NGOs are actually doing would abide by FPIC practice, even if it's not required, right? So here, this provide us more of like support, but there's a need to make it operational. How do you make sure or that all these rights of FPIC are actually ensured throughout ASEAN policies and programs on social forestry and climate change? And then in 2007, there was this directive, which is it's a very strong directive to develop national guidelines on FPIC with the full and effective participation of indigenous peoples and local communities. However, if you look at how ASEAN policymaking is in a context of non-intervention. So if you have very good progress at, for example, Indonesia on FPIC, it does not really mean that we will have improved progress in Laos. So there is really no guarantee on that. That's why we have this kind of platform to really discuss and distill how we can support duty bearers like the states to kind of like act on their statements like this. Okay, so this is very important as we move along. No? And then here in 2018, the ASEAN Working Group on Social Forestry, the same group, together with support from different CSOs at the regional level, including NTFP, you have ICRAF, and you have also MRLG. So there was this ASEAN guidelines on promoting responsible investment in food and agriculture and forestry sector, which provides very specific mention, explicit mention of FPIC in areas where investments are to be deployed. Okay. And then the ASEAN guidelines on agroforestry development in 2018 also provide explicit mention of FPIC. Okay. So we now come to like looking back at what is the benefit of applying for FPIC. Usually, from my observation, some would just look at FPIC as just as one right. Of course, FPIC does not exist in a vacuum. When you talk about FPIC, it's actually operationalizing the principles of rights-based development. When you say rights-based development, such big words for us, right? So it actually would include looking at not only the consultation process, but looking at the rights of that community to determine their own development, to determine their own livelihood priorities, to determine how they would actually conduct their traditional occupation, even if the entire world may be progressing towards a different kind of development, or if their occupation, for example, needs technology, then it does not mean that the technology framework will be now the framework where certain technology transfer would be applied in that particular scenario. So that is where there is some confusion with communities when they are asked to provide consent, and if the proponent is actually not knowledgeable or has this ambiguous or maybe even misplaced notion of FPIC as a simple one-time getting consent or consultation, there lies the problem. So it's very important to look at FPIC as a very important aspect of operational rights-based development in totality, because for this community, of course, the rights is not just a simple right to live, but it's a mixture of the right to have the land, the right to life, and their economic development are, of course, in a different worldview than ours. I think here he can articulate it better than I do. Okay, good practice that should be used in relation to investment of the country. This has been some of the observations of the regional, of the different country studies that FPIC is used now at the Mekong countries as well as in other ASEAN countries as a good practice in relation to investment. Because when you are an investor, you would want, of course, first, certainty of your investment. When you talk about certainty, it means certainty in terms of time, certainty in terms of the scope of activities, meaning if I invest that I would have, for example, mobile network facility in a particular area, and I would invest this kind of money, of course, it would be against my interest if I would not secure an agreement with a community that would put my investment into like a 10-year or 25-year period. So it's a very simple explanation that. But more often, time is not only the factor. You have to look at first the scope of that particular investment. This is where some of the barriers and some of the problems of FPIC agreement is coming from, because there is not adequate information and of the investment and the impacts of the investment. We can discuss that later. Then some would think the benefit of FPIC could be because at the country level, it is complying with obligation in the implementation of international policy programs and mechanisms, not only in terms of being a good nation that subscribe to the tenets of international law, international environmental law, but also because compliance with this law would bring in capacity building support, would bring in other resources that the country would need. Anyway, all these are being harnessed by CSOs here in the room that are involved in FPIC advocacy, as well as FPIC, not only advocacy, but FPIC practice at the community level, at the country level. So defining consent. So I took a different approach in this aspect, because there are many ways where consent is actually defined in different books and FPIC guidelines, protocol. But from where a simple way of looking at consent is could be as a social contract. But we do not discount the fact that when I say a social contract, it is just so legal. No, it's a social contract, meaning it is an obligation by one person to another, and that kind of agreement can be in various forms. When I say social, and not just put contract there, because usually under most laws, contract should be written, right? But it can be not written, it can be just a blood compact, or it could be just what we call this, a simple agreement, oral agreement that was witnessed by a community, or it could be just the norm in the normal course of community relation. But that is the important point that we have to distinguish. While now that we are into like making sure that FPIC is also with standards, how we will now define consent? What would be the parameters? Do we make it, for example, a written one? Do we put, for example, that it would be in some form of a document, in a language that is understood by all? So there is that kind of course, discussion that needs to happen. When you say also consent, we are talking about also of the different notions of consent, similar to different notions of what is development. Okay, so here very important to know certain areas where we have to discuss, so that we can actually also build from our experiences in FPIC, and from that experience can inform policymaker na maybe these are practices that can guide policy making and lessen ambiguity of FPIC as both a principle, a concept, and a process. So on consent, so what are the areas where community considered as needing consent? So it also would be important in defining parameters of what is consent. What would be the actions of giving consent? So mostly, an example would be some community would just raise their hand. That would be already consent. And then there's a picture as evidence of consent. Okay. And who gives consent? Who gives consent? Meaning, meaning before we do an FPIC process, then we have already identified who are the legitimate rights holder. So now we are now putting a word legitimate under as an adjective to rights holder. Before it was just usually rights holder, but because as you know, processes evolve and more interests are into the forest areas, agriculture areas where communities are actually managing their lands. So you now have to distinguish legitimate rights holder versus illegitimate rights holder, which is actually redundant because of the rights holder. But it is very important and in different context. And of course, you have to link it to forest resource management and also the role of women, because the role of women in consent seeking is also important in terms of, are they as individuals, do their rights cover actually giving consent? So in some areas that is not yet agreed upon, and in some areas that is evolving, so that needs to be considered. Determination of kinds of projects should undergo consent. So this is important in terms of, are you making consent? Are we pushing for consent that needs to be within a certain state or formal framework? This is where we have the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act process of FPIC. There has been, say, 6 operational policy on FPIC in the past 20 years, and it still is problematic, but there are, of course, very important gains. So here in the Philippines, there is a third party required to certify, confirm, affirm that consent. And the process, you now have a next process. The next process would be the formal process. So a communicative consent and the formal state process of certifying, confirming, and affirming that consent. Is that something that we think should be advocated in other parts of ASEAN? And here, of course, full understanding of the concept involved needed just on consent. Okay, so now that we have like an idea, or maybe more confusion on the idea of consent, let's go to defining what is free. So it's free, prior, informed consent. So when I talk about free, usually I'm using the most plain meaning in terms of absence or free from manipulation, coercion, intimidation, bribery, what else? This is very much what we have in terms of or description here, but we can use it because that's also where it's a standard that can be used and also improved on. Here, these are questions that we often use as CSOs, looking into how we evaluate, or how we not evaluate, even assess, or just as a standards of checking if a certain process that the community is undergoing or has completed can be say free. Okay, so first you have to look at what was the position of the community on the project before the FPIC process started. Is this position similar or different from the position of the community after the FPIC process? So you would know if there was really a difference, and the difference of from a yes or a no, or a maybe to a no or to a yes, was triggered by something that was external. Okay, maybe giving rice, promising leaders a few thousands of dollars, or promising a building, or what else. So here we can also look at the community and leaders receiving that form of support in connection to the FPIC process, and maybe look at the kind of support. If it was just support, a little bit of support just for logistically maybe it's not bribery. So there is actually a wide range of possible context here, and it's very important for us CSO supporting community processes on FPIC that we know where there is already manipulation or intimidation or bribery. Okay, so it is a case-to-case scenario. So it could be, you can also look out on a possibility that some of the community members that were usually against the project or pro the project now influence community positions about the project, and look at how that particular community. Yes. Hello. Yes. Okay.
Go ahead, Ms. Edna.
Okay. And then what was the participation involvement of tribal leaders or whatever is appropriate to use on customer practice in the FPIC process? So you would look at free in terms of looking as well of the involvement of different leaders. Why is it important? The context of this kind of statement is that there would be instances, and you would be surprised, where some leaders are, what I call this, are put into maybe a trip somewhere, or maybe what's to call this, was made to believe that there was another activity in another place, so that they cannot participate in this kind of process. Okay. And then it's also very important that in an FPIC process, so we're now into the FPIC process, because it is my way of making you understand what is free. And I think it's more of like more practical, because I know you have read so much about what is free in FPIC. So I would like to make it more practical. So in this part is, what was the role of the proponent in this aspect? Mostly, it could be that in certain areas, the proponent, meaning the applicant or the one seeking the community consent. We're talking about community consent here. Is always in the area, or in most cases, if it's a big project, what they would do is that they would hire social safeguards team to do the FPIC for them. So sometimes they would hire an NGO who would facilitate things for them. So there are many aspects of looking at how free is the consent. Mostly in instances where big projects, and these are conservation projects, it is usually an accepted process that a big NGO would get a partner NGO who has worked with the community to support the consent-seeking process. But that alone should not be like a guarantee that it is free. You have to check railroading or bias of NGOs, bias of community in favor of this NGO who have worked long time in the area, but this NGO is now providing as well new services that might not be in the previous agreement. So very important for us to also open our eyes to that practice. Now we go to prior. It's simple. It's supposed to be prior to any activity or development. So you would look at when was the FPIC process conducted or started. So we should usually do a chronology of events. So there was this meeting by this group to a leader, and then it started that. And you would, in my experience, sometimes it's very frustrating, right? As NTFP, we went to FPIC application for a project, and after a year we didn't get that affirmation from the government, but we had a consent. That was a RED Plus project, for a project where we ask communities if they, so this is a case where we want to teach community to have natural dyes instead of synthetic dyes. I remember staff a livelihood enterprise officer, was frustrated because it took him 6 months or more to the process. So, but I've seen documents where big project has discussed with the committee. Now, the next day there was a document from the committee, and the next week there is certification from government. So you have all these kind of very exciting cases, and you can read that in the maybe Olivia can share the link of that. After this meeting, there are many instances like that already documented in the Philippines. So did the consultations coincide with major community activities? Okay, vis-a-vis cropping calendar. Because when you say prior, you also look at was it timed when there are few members present to receive that kind of information. So if it's like if you would see, and I can see that, and when you're looking at FPIC processes of different government, from FPIC processes, that those that are really problematic or hard to explain, they would time that it is where the community is busy with something else. But that would really have a bad effect to the project. Eventually, when the project is being implemented, community would say, what is that project? What is our responsibility? And they don't understand actually the activities being implemented. So have more delays. And delays would mean loss of time. And if business, that would be loss of very important profits or very important processes. How much time given to the committee to arrive at a decision regarding the proposed project? This is very important. So it's a case-to-case basis, and that would be related to the level of capacity, the capacity of community to receive a particular information in a given time. Okay, so it is connected to inform. When you say inform, usually simple, plain meaning is full disclosure of relevant information of the project. And when you say relevant information of the project, as CSO supporting, so that is our framework here, right? CSO supporting community process, you would now, as a matter of practice, define already what is relevant per what kind of project. Sometimes this would entail asking community if this is the intervention of a particular third party seeking consent. What information would you want to receive? And so this is the time when an NGO supporting community would now complement, because some of the community members would not have also the capacity to fully grasp the impacts of the project or the effects of that. Usually, they would have also short time, meaning their risk assessment. So now it's actually risk assessment of the process. A simple risk assessment is just short term. As supporting NGO, we should open their eyes to both short-term, medium-term, and long-term effect of the project so that we can determine relevant information needed. Okay, so from my experience, going into an FPIC negotiation, once an NGO would say, ask a question to the FPIC proponent, so if you are putting this particular mobile network, okay, is there an effect to or airwaves that would affect hearing or would affect or telecommunications because or telecommunication signal because our students are online learning and of course safe effects. So it opened the discussion of this kind of impact that is unknown to also to community members. So what information was given to you about the project? Who provided you with the information about the proposed project? How was the information disseminated? so these were like a question that you would ask communities, or you would ask yourself if you are actually looking at the concept of, was that an informed consent? Okay. Was there anything in the presentation of that was not clear to you? So usually, from my experience, those that are ambiguous, they would just gloss it over. But it is very important to make sure that there are no cracks in this particular aspect. Because mind you, this is the most important aspect moving forward with any project. And this would lessen issues of the community. I've seen documentation of full health crisis of community because there was no disclosure that could be water contamination in this kind of area. So there were deaths to community members. Okay. So and important also to look at how it was explained. And then here the communication materials that were used. Is it something, of course, that are user-friendly in a language, as well as probably in comics, probably in pictograms, or probably in the way that they would discuss it. Okay. The last part is the cost. Sometimes when you look at a cost of FPIC, so this is, you would not say, oh, this is not usually disclosed, or like, you would see the cost of FPIC. It should be also a sign, a telltale sign of certain what are lapses. Sometimes the cost of FPIC could be very minimal, but for a very big project, it was like so minimal. Or so there are ways of looking at that. I don't want to elaborate because that would maybe I would say something that would be very not good. Anyway, now this is the part that is not emphasized in the process of FPIC across, even in the Philippines, where there is already a full standard. That FPIC is an iterative process, and that requires monitoring. And the monitoring can be formal, informal, and because from the basic concept, it's a right to say yes or no. So when there is already a community intention that they want to pull out and they said to say no, then that is the process that there should be another process of making sure that issues are addressed. So here you would look at, usually what is being monitored are the benefits to the community. And don't be misled when I say benefit. It is not necessarily monetary. It could be program benefit. It could be benefit that is well-being of the community, ecosystem services. It could be as basic as providing health centers, education, etc. Okay. Usually in an agreement, they would receive some funds. So you would look at how the funds are received, how the benefits are received, and you would also look at the safeguard system, meaning when you have an introduction of an activity or a program, embedded in that process of implementation of that activity would be usually an indigenous people's plan or a gender plan, if that is already a big project, or a simple way of looking at protection of IP rights based on putting in the agreement that the framework for implementation would be the community plan. It's the leader who would call certain grievances, and then the use of grievance mechanism would be the existing customary law mechanism, etc. That is required in some jurisdiction, including the Philippines. Here, you would look at also details or measure to protect affected portion of the ancestral domain. Ancestral domain here is used in a general manner, looking at territories, looking at both a forested landscape as well as lowlands, as long as there are forest-dependent communities. And here, there should be also a lookout into the responsibilities of the applicant, the proponent, and responsibilities of the host communities. This can be as general as it can be, and as specific as it can be, depending on the different contexts. Continuing on the monitoring is this grievance. In the Philippines, you would have a surety bond. And a surety bond would be where community can go for damages when an agreement would go awry or like there will be some like issues. They can go after that. There can be remedies and penalties, and it can be as simple as a community grievance mechanism. Now, you would need also need to look at how the process of complaints would be addressed within the agreement or within the implementation. Usually they would say there's a grievance mechanism. But from my experience, when there are complaints, the community members do not know what is the first step. Do they have to write something? Or do they have to tell the leadership? Do they have to tell the proponent? Who is in charge? How many days to decide a complaint? What if the complaint is something as major as expelling a program, expelling a company? What is the role of the state? What is the role of a CSO? What would the role of local governments? And if it's in the protected area, what would be the role of the different management bodies there, etc.? Okay. Usually, it's best if the agreement or the consent or the contract would now have all this identified instances where the community can revoke the FPIC. Okay. And it should be very clear in how revocation can be done. Okay. So I've discussed some of them in terms of the research findings. So the research findings was mentioned also by Femi. It's actually related to customary tenure, and some of the researchers are here. So maybe later they can share more on FPIC. So across the research, you can say that FPIC and its importance are generally not known or understood, and how it's linked to other processes, like I've said earlier, rights to livelihood, rights to customary tenure, and how it relates or does not relate to FPIC and other safeguard mechanism. And usually this can be provided by groups like us who have more experience on the ground. That is why it's very important that when we have FPIC processes, these are documented, whether that processes are successful or not. So very important to have documentation so that we will know where we can improve, as well as where policymakers would need also to act on. So here, there are no clear rules on what program project activities impacting land, natural resources have consultation requirement or consent. So this is a major finding, because for us, usually you would say we need FPIC. Okay, the community would insist on exercising the right to FPIC, and then we say yes, we ensure FPIC, but how? So it's very important. Maybe we look at what activities would trigger FPIC. Okay, at what level of FPIC would this be? Do we have to define it in terms of consent with leaders, consent with communities, a check on the consent is still present, or is still a yes after a year, after 2 years? and of course, looking at benefit sharing. Here, it's very important to continue working on FPIC, understanding FPIC, trying to lessen ambiguity on FPIC, because cases of encroachment are still happening even with all this assurance of rights-based developments, assurance of recognizing the rights to FPIC, assurance that development financing like that of the Green Climate Fund, USAID, USAID, as well as others, for example, adherence to VGGT by companies and by country governments. But still, I think personally, these are not enough. So very important for us to move forward with an informed position. So challenges, there are many challenges actually. So I mentioned some of them, and this is fully understanding the worldview of indigenous people. Land is life, and it has both spiritual and cultural economic importance. Often are just lip service. We can talk about more of this, but I have many things to share on this, but I will stop there. And then the concept of development offered to indigenous people in the territory, and usually the concept of development needs to be also look into what is the community concept of development, because the right to self-determination is based on that. And usually this is where the issue starts. Recognition of the existence of indigenous people within the formal state law. So you have pressing issue of that in Myanmar, Vietnam, and Laos. Then I've mentioned this undefined process. So when a community would say we have FPIC with this group, who says that, oh, that is not actually FPIC, that is not saying standard. So usually it's largely defined at the national level, except in the Philippines. Then are we looking into who checks standards against which to assess and measure the compliance to FPIC? Situating the consent process and impacts of project activities in the context of existing livelihood, traditional knowledge, and forest practices. Capacity for me to fully understand information and level of details needed, adequate time, managing different opposing views of community leaders, and overlapping rights to land. Okay. When you talk about overlapping rights to land, it's very important also in the context of social forestry, REDD+, because what I mean here is that there could be community overlapping rights to land. And this is important because social forestry tenure is also given to indigenous territories. And this is an aspect where there is also ambiguity at the national level, and even in the Philippines, when we have social forestry laws and indigenous people's rights law, it is an issue. When a social forestry is granted as a tenure, as a privilege by the state to a group of community association or a people's organization, but that particular grant of tenure is within a bigger territory, then who now gets to decide if that particular rights is to be extended, is to be renewed by government? Then there is an FPIC process there. While it is already known now, we are grappling on the process of how it will be implemented. My last part would be, bad case of FPIC. Do I still have time, Dassel?
Yes, 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. Okay, the bad case of FPIC. Why am I showcasing this? Because this has been also raised in a tenure webinar last year. This is the case of the Kaliwa Dam. I know you have heard of this many times, and I would treat this as something as an evolving process as well, because I think the process is not yet done. Although for some, they said it is, but it's not. So you have a bad case of legitimacy and legality of the process, leadership struggle and the role of government. We can say much on the role of government here. And then customary process and political process at play. So this is what is called development-induced displacement, resettlement, and project-induced displacement. You can say that in as many as an example, right? Sorry. The case of the Kaliwa Dam. Okay. So the Kaliwa Dam, so this is the area where Olive is operating in terms of support to indigenous peoples. So you would have there the Agta Dumaga tribe, a nomadic tribe, but was kind of course, forced to settle because they have to claim their ancestral domain title. But it's a very big area. You have it's spanning several provinces and several municipalities. Several provinces you have here for this particular aspect. The dam is two provinces, spanning two provinces. Okay, Rizal provinces, Rizal and Quezon provinces. Okay, so it is a government project. Can you see as you can see here? But it was supported by financed by the China Energy Engineering Corporation, a state-owned corporation. Since this is part of the big support of China on infrastructure development in the Philippines and those loans. So you can see here details on that. So, okay. So there were varying opinions and perspective on what would be the impact of the project. So you would see here many pronouncements from different groups pushing and for FPIC as well as against FPIC. So, okay. So I would not discuss that further, but on the aspect of FPIC, okay. So here the process started with what the IPRA would provide in terms of several community consultation. So in the Philippines, an FPIC is triggered based on the of a category of the project. In this particular aspect, this is an extractive, intrusive, large-scale project. So it requires three community consultations spaced usually in a few weeks, a few months, depending on the availability of the community as well as the NCIP. So here, what happened here is you have several in the picture here was the first assembly in Rizal province where it is also affected, but the actual dam is in Quezon province. So the impacts here are different. But you see here, the first meeting is about an orientation of what are the rights of indigenous people, particularly the right of FPIC, and then they would also discuss the procedure for FPIC and would agree on a date on a second assembly. Now this is the time that they would now discuss the project. The proponent would provide, for example, the impacts of the project, and this is where the community can ask in technical details. But this was a big dam and a very important dam for Metro Manila. So you would also feel that the community is kind of divided, that they wanted to provide support to water services in Manila. They wanted to be supportive of government, but at the same time, they want to benefit and to make sure that whatever their decision would not impact their lands, their livelihood, and particularly would not have flooding in the area. So here, you would say that, so the community would be relocated from their forest areas into this kind of proposed design of kind of what do you call this, a settlement where you have a schoolhouse, the housing, tribal hall. So this was the design given, but this was not given during the consultation. This is like afterwards. So what happened here is that okay, in the process, so this was a long process, and communities have no access to technical information in terms of the impact, the area. So you have several NGOs supporting the mapping. So I see here Mylene, AFA was also supporting the process in terms of its partner group, Pakisama. You would also have different groups as well, including, as I said, Olive supporting the process of distilling the impacts of I was a volunteer legal counsel that was representing the community, but in the process I had to go I had to do some other things. But if you look at the impacts, it was wide, but the community was also struggling with other community groups within the big ancestral domain in terms of leadership. So what happened here was actually a process of a no at the community level in terms of customary. So I am now ready for some discussion. So
Yes, thanks, Ms. Edna, and we are opening the floor for questions or clarifications on the very comprehensive discussion on free, prior, and informed consent. Any questions or clarifications to our very able speaker? I see Olive raises her hand. Ate Olive.
Hi, good afternoon, Dazzle. Good afternoon, everyone. Hi. This FPIC process is very overwhelming to us. I read, as Edna said, we came up with a case study in 2011 to 2012. So we read a lot of violations related to the element free, prior, informed, and the consent. These were thoroughly explained by Edna a while ago. And Chai is also here. She's also one of the researchers. So coming up with recommendations to this study, we expected that somehow, because of the revised guidelines, we will come up with better implementation of the FPIC. Other countries may think that the guidelines in the Philippines is very ideal, as we have separate set of guidelines, for example, for extractive, intrusive, large scale, and we also have separate guidelines for the non-extractives. We also have separate guidelines for the conduct of IKSP research. So a lot of guidelines which are somewhat ideal, but we realized that it's not really enough to have the policy, to have the guidelines, but it is highly influenced by the implementers themselves and also the overall governance system, particularly from the national government down to the local level. So for instance, Edna has already mentioned the Kaliwa case, and it's now under complaint. What Edna mentioned about the grievance, the community leaders already did that. They filed complaint to NCIP, particularly to the FPIC team. But the NCIP had the resolution to defend the FPIC team. So they are saying that the conduct of the FPIC is correct, and there's no violation conducted by the FPIC team. Right now, there are also formal and legal cases filed. So this is very complicated.
I see Chai raising her hand, Dazzle.
Yes, go ahead, Ms. Chai.
Hi, Edna. Good afternoon. So mine is a different case. The Kaliwa Dam is a very concerning case as well, where we can see the interface and efficacy of FPIC policy. Mine is more of the culture-based FPIC that we studied when we had the case studies for FPIC. So that was how many years that was mentioned by Olive. So now there's a new challenge because I wanted to show a picture of the protected area. This CADT is divided between 60% in Kitanglad protected area, but the gateway is it's not part of the buffer zones or in the core protected area. So this is more where the livelihoods are. But in the last 2 years with the pandemic happening and people are trapped to stay at home, so there's an increasing demand for agribusiness expansions for pineapple and bananas for export. So BAI is now the head claimant is confronted with individuals with a surfacing title, brandishing it and harassing BAI that if she will stop the development in their areas inside the country because they have prior rights, they will have BAI arrested or have the police order the police to arrest her. So this is very alarming for BAI. She's part of PAMBI. She is a peace builder, a mediator, but the situation is for now the attack was on her person, and right now we've written the NTFP Central Office to intervene. So it has the chair has directed the provincial officer to provide a report in a week's time. So looking forward for that report. The PAMBI could not yet interfere because it's still outside the protected area, but the thoughts about green livelihood landscape really is inspiring. Even with the new PASO said that we've been strict with the non-destructive livelihoods in protected areas and partner communities, and there you are, concrete evidence of the intrusion of companies. We are like trapped to move and to act. So this is a timely discussion as well because BAI was asking the individuals like, can you have an FPIC with us? Can we talk this out because you're inside the CADT? But these are individuals, so the company is hiding behind the titles of these individuals. And BAI at one point had a discussion with her 2 hours before this meeting, said that maybe it's okay to say yes for 15 hectares. What is 15 hectares? And I said, yeah, and then you will be showering with all the chemicals from the pineapples. And your areas that are protected and preserved through culture. So what will happen to that? So I think part of our really pursuing FPIC, the rights of indigenous peoples, also the rights to the environment, and the unseen beings that are protected and known. This is the forefront of the advocacy of the Kitanglad tribes. So this is a test case. So last December, there are mountaineers who went backdoor. So they're being penalized, case still holding in court. While those are able to face the tribe and say sorry, we're able to say sorry. So that's a very tribal mechanism. But with this company and the rent that is being received by individuals, so can we see FPIC as a mechanism for defense with individuals and then also with companies because they're the ones compensating for the lease for 20, 25 years and tell BAI, better shut up, allow us to use it for 20, 25 years. But what would happen to the tribal lands being protected in the protected area and in the CADT? So this is really a relevant discussion. So I'm very much appreciate this that we had this. Thanks Edna for sharing, and then NTFP and all the circles with the GLA 2.0, that we need to really be forward looking and be able to be abreast with all these challenges. The issue on Kaliwa made dari tuwali sa kitang lad pride. And at one point, Olive, if you remember in our learning trip, one of the bailans of Talaandig said, can we have a conference among ourselves, the babaylans? Because we're the ones articulating the rights of those we cannot see. And these are not being talked about, these are not being supported. That's why we just only confine ourselves with the visible rights of animals, plants, human beings, but not the spiritual rights. So these are really challenges that I'm holding. So I was able to comfort Bai, but she was really, she was really harassed. Like, she's a peace builder, but there are also individuals that do not recognize those rights. So how do we fortify our defenses for the community to ensure that the rights are respected? But I said, admittedly, for kin, baka kulang yung IEC namin, and we need to be aggressive on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I have a quick reply, Dazzle?
Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, friends, it's very important to look at what Chai and Olive mentioned in terms of this discussion, right? Wherein, so you have there first is communities that would have already recognized rights over their areas, and these are already documented, and then are used to the process of FPIC. They are still facing a lot of challenges in terms of implementing FPIC, because first, there was no linking to the security of tenure. Remember what Chai was mentioning. There were titles that were shown to the community leader to actually support development that she doesn't want. So very important that the foundational issue of having of applying FPIC, it would go to first is having a secure rights, linking it to the area. How much area would a community have in terms of management rights, use rights, and what are the uses that these areas can have in terms of both legal uses as well as forest uses, etc. And second is that FPIC there, from what I've understand, what Olivia and Chai mentioned, is that even with all this policy guidance or affirmation of rights to FPIC, there were no supporting technical processes like linking it to risk assessment. Because at the end of the day, if you look at the problems of the community there, what about implications on pesticide that would it allow? If I allow 15 hectares of that for banana plantation, but they would make a drone fly, or usually it's actually a small helicopter, right? In that area of Mindanao, that would fly for the fertilizer, and it affects, of course, water and eventually health of the community. So that is important to link the process of consent seeking to a full risk assessment and other safeguard mechanism, including as well right to grievance. So right to grievance is very important in this process. And then if everything else fails, there should be a judicial process that can be used. In the case of FPIC, because in the Philippines there is that legal framework, but even with that legal framework, there is still very few, or I think not the precedent in terms of judicial, that can be used as guidance for further interpreting FPIC issue. So these are things that other countries in ASEAN who are still developing their national guidelines on FPIC would have to look into, particularly on making sure that this process is useful for community, and in the long run really operationalize all the rights of indigenous people under FPIC and under customary law.
Thanks, Miss Edna. I think on that note, you mentioned the FPIC cases in other countries aside from the Philippines. Miss Femi has a question related to that. She posted in the chat, in cases of violation of FPIC guidelines or standards, what is the recourse available to the indigenous people and local communities under the law? In the case of the Philippines or other ASEAN countries, are there cases where there is a successful reversal of decision and the violation is proven? And then I'll call on Ms. again.
Yeah.
Hi, that's all. I'm Sophie from the NGO Forum.
Hi, Sophie.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I come late, but I have some question because regarding to the applying FPIC in Cambodia, especially in the draft environmental code. The NGO try to put the input, especially regarding to FPICs in the draft environmental code, but it seems that the government does not accept or willing not to accept about FPIC, because they think that FPICs, if you refer to this, it means that they cannot do anything regarding to the projects or anything that happened to the areas of indigenous people. It's so hard to apply, and so it means that from the perspective of the organization, from the NGO side, we don't think that we need to have FPIC or need to talk about ethics in the law or anything, but at least we have to think that the principle of ethics should be integrated in the law or in the environmental code. But in the case of Cambodia, we think that it's really hard for us to mainstream the principle of ethics in the draft law or environmental code, because they seem like to put only public participation or require effective participation only, but to apply or to have the principle of ethics in the law or draft law it may not possible. And to this idea, what should we do in order to at least, if we don't talk about ethics, at least we should have a principle or any principle that should be more meaningful for indigenous people or community people that engage in the project that develop, and should have a meaningful participation from them, and should meaningful participation, it means not only allow them for participate, but should inform them all the information and should discuss them about the effect that will be happen to them if the project happen, and should also provide some information how to deal with those issues before the implementation of the project. It means that we need to discuss more and more, or at least the affected community would be happy if they can see the project start. So I think maybe it is, I need some comments how we integrate this principle in the context of law or regulation. Thank you.
Hello.
Go ahead, Miss Edna. Did you catch Sophie's?
Yeah, I catch the question. Sorry, I was disconnected. So the question was basically in Cambodia, there is difficulty of putting the word FPIC explicitly in the EIA, right? In the environmental code. Right?
Environmental code.
The environmental code, yes. So I think it's so, you know, actually as a policy person, you don't need to really have FPIC explicitly in that particular code if the government is also not ready, the policymakers are not ready. Note that example would be if you look at the Cancun safeguards for RED, because this is where also Cambodia and the rest of ASEAN are very interested. There is no mention of FPIC, the word FPIC in the Cancun safeguards for RED. What is mentioned there is the full and effective participation of indigenous people and indigenous peoples. Okay, but then that the entire document of course, the Cancun Safeguards is also, there's a note towards that. It is also what we call this, respecting or adapting. So noting that the General Assembly has adopted UNDRIP, which is by itself uses the principle of FPIC in observing Cancun Safeguards, and of course in the any climate change initiative. So in a way, it's an example wherein countries arrive at a decision not to have FPIC because it's a very controversial term in the Cancun Safeguards and useful effective participation. But in a way, because it is noting on DRIP and on DRIP is saying FPIC, the implementation of RED Plus in Cambodia is actually using the term FPIC. Okay. Now, it's also just a matter of name, because in some countries they are using consultation and consent together, right? So what is important is that at the national level there is now more understanding that, one, there's a need for full and effective participation, and this can happen in these various ways, and eventually it would evolve into something like really at a standard of FPIC. Or maybe you can define FPIC in your own context. It doesn't have to have the term FPIC. So I think that's my suggestion, because it will really be very hard for policymakers to agree on that term when that term is by itself ambiguous to them. Because who has the right to FPIC? Who are indigenous people in Cambodia? What triggers FPIC? So usually when you do policy making, that particular policy need to be operational. So one of the issues they don't put it there is the lack of practice guidelines, the lack of operational, and generally a misunderstood concept and ambiguity. So that's my comment. I hope it helps. But I think some of our colleagues in the room would have also something to share about how these kind of things are developing in the country level. It doesn't have to be really FPIC, but it's important to have first the practice at the community level and understanding, and then policy would evolve later on, because it's really a long process.
Thanks, Ms. Edna. Sophie, you have
Thank Edna, and that's all. In the case of RED Plus, I understood that in Cambodia, because it is requirement from UNFCCC, we have FPIC or safeguard that need to apply in RED Plus. But it seems in different projects, it's mean a different application as well, because UNFCCC is the requirement. That's why we have to follow that requirement. And another thing is just want to know if at the Asian level, if we are going, how the government of Cambodia or government of the Asian that they are interested to FPIC. I want to know about the progress. Thank you.
Dazzle? I think Dazzle and Femi can answer that.
Sorry, the progress. Maybe just for us, we are, for NTFP-EP, we are helping with facilitating the process of customary tenure recognition, a regional framework for customary tenure recognition in forested landscapes in the ASEAN region. At the moment, it's still in draft 0. And we are still working on the first full draft of the guideline. But FPIC is part of the one major principle of that regional framework, and Ms. Edna is also helping us to develop that regional framework together with the under the ambit of ASEAN Working Group on Social Forestry. So at the moment it's still in the draft stage, but there will be in the coming months there will be regional consultations to further to review that draft, whether it's already good enough, and also to hopefully to have there's a request last year also to have some country consultations on the draft regional framework. But yes, again, it's still in the regional process, but hopefully when it's approved or adopted at the regional level, there will be an opportunity to unpack or maybe operationalize this regional framework at the country level. So hopefully the momentum stays on. Maybe Ms. Femi would like to add further information on that.
No, I think that's enough. That's enough, Tazo.
Thanks, Ms. Fems.
Sure.
Maybe two more questions. Miss Edna, you got cut off. There's a question from Miss Femi earlier on in cases of violation of FPIC guidelines or standards, what is the recourses available to IPLCs under the law in the case of the Philippines or in other ASEAN countries? Are there cases, or were you able to experience cases where there is a successful reversal of the decision and the violation is proven?
Yeah. So under ASEAN, there are platforms. For example, if you look at the HR, there are complaints being raised there, and some of it would also be connected to FPIC. As of now, I don't have the details of cases, but I can look into it. But it is as a general answer, it is within the framework of the human rights treaties violation. It is where it is situated at the ASEAN level and at the different countries. So they would usually use mechanism like expert mechanism on the rights of IPs or and the UN reporting mechanism, etc. Here in the Philippines, the one in Kaliwa Dam would be a very exciting case. Once, hopefully, it will be resolved soon and would create really good jurisprudence for us to improve on FPIC and to make sure that it is really free, prior, informed consent of indigenous people. So, yeah.
Thanks, Ms. Edna. Ms. Chai has a raised hand earlier, and then maybe last one would be Panhangan. Go ahead, Ms. Chai.
Yeah, Edna, I was waiting for you to come back. So if it's okay with you, I can share the image of the Daraguyan map inside the Kitanglad Park. Just one image where my question is based there.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, so
Can she share the screen, Dazzle?
Yeah, Robin, can you allow Ms. Chai to share screen? Thank you.
Can you see it now? It's there.
It's coming.
It's coming. There.
Yeah. Okay. So you can imagine the entry point of landed individuals leasing the land to Philippine Packing. So they are now at this point here. So that's why the PAMB, the Protected Area Management Board, could not really interfere because it's still outside the buffer and the core protected areas. So the expansion of plantation is already in the areas where the livelihoods of people are concentrated, not in the protected area, not even in the buffer zone. So my question, Edna, since these are the companies hiding behind the lease individual titles, 15 hectares, 10 hectares, 5 hectares, but in the spirit of protecting the CADP, and they also resort to file a cease and desist order while waiting for the NCIP to intervene and the good court, matter if it's valid or invalid, rather than they're starting to destroy areas of the CADP. So this is what makes our leader surprised and, grieving how come this has happened. And so this is really the trend, no? With the pandemic, the attraction is really to go to forested landscapes. So this is also where we advocate for green livelihood, green forests. It's really the governance, not just the protected area, but really a mix of modalities that favor the survival of the forest and the species that are being protected here. So just to give you an imagination how alarming it could be, it may be just 15 hectares from two families, another 5 hectares, another 5 hectares, because it's really proximate to a good intact old growth forest owned by the tribes. So can they issue a cease and desist? Is there a remedy, even though it's still not in the buffer and core protected areas, but in the spirit of protecting the Kadti, because so many titles are now coming up these days, especially after the still in the pandemic. So those are my concern to
Yeah.
hopefully can enlighten us on this remedy for the community.
So if there will be that kind of action, the first issue that needs to be resolved is the legality or the rightful claimant. So if
The
so that would
titles.
still be a long process. So you said that this is the ancestral domain, the entire thing is the ancestral domain, and then
Yes.
you would have so it's there's a title to that, right? So there's a kadti, there's a
Yes.
there's a title. And then
Yes.
what is the legal status of the land? Are all forest lands, agricultural lands, in terms of legal status?
A large part of the area is really part of the protected area, but if you see the open areas with light green, these are where the communities are and their livelihoods, because of their partners in park management. So most of the livelihoods are focused now in the fringes of the protected area. But these are also being now targeted by plantations. So basically outside the park, but inside the country. But there are individuals brandishing titles that they have listed to the Philippine Packing already. That's
So
why
it means,
the machineries are going up now.
so probably the individuals, those are titles. So those are titles that are private titles. So you have to check if the titles are in the forest land or in the agricultural or A level and disposable land. Now, if the title is in the forest land, which is part of the ancestral domain, then that is it's a null title, because there can be no title in a forest land except an ancestral domain title. Now, that's the first step. So it is not just a process of having all this disease order. What they would do is go back to the resolution of the land issue. What can be done in terms of securing human security, that is not land security. First is human security, is in a different aspect, not related to land. So there are many options to secure human security and land security there. But then you would go back to first the issue of legality of those titles, and then later on the legality of those leases by these persons, proposed owners to the plantation. So that is now the issue there. Of course, NCIP can intervene anytime on this aspect. They don't, indigenous people do not need to file a case for NCIP to intervene. The role of NCIP, as far as I understand and based on the law, they can intervene automatically if there is an issue to that. They do not need to wait for a community to complain. So that's hello.
Thanks, Miss Edna.
Yeah.
Ma'am Chai, it was your question was sufficiently answered by Miss Edna.
TEP would have a greater role at this time. The PAPI are still studying what they can do, because in the ambit of protected landscapes, the encroachment bit by company will eventually eat up the whole, right? So it starts with small. So in some areas, there's titles that say grasslands, cornlands, but these are bukidnon. So they are not flatlands. So it's really forest areas, I should say.
Okay, thank you, Ma'am Shai and Ms. Edna. Maybe one last question before we officially end. Sorry, we're already over time, 8 minutes over time. From Panhangan, can you unmute Panhangan and maybe introduce yourself also?
Yes. Okay. Thank you for your sharing. But I just one question to ask you about the. I want to know about the result based. That should be get from the only Philippines or from the other country in South Asia. About the result that you have to presentation to all of the participation on this.
The FPIC, that policy that is being developed. Is that the question, right, Dazzle?
Yes, I want to know about your expectation is will be bring the side effect to the all of the country in the South Asia or only Philippines?
Yeah, it should be, it is for the entire ASEAN. So that is where the advocacy is at the moment, that a regional level FPIC guidelines or FPIC toolbox, maybe a toolbox first, and then it's connected to a guidelines on customary tenure, because the right of FPIC is very important in terms of securing customary tenure. So it would be at the regional level. What is being discussed now is that what getting experiences from the different national level FPIC experience to see what would be the form and what would be the most useful way regional level guidelines should be written, or should be developed, so that it would be useful to all, whether you have a national law like the Philippines requiring FPIC, or you don't have any law, or you have other policies that only say consultation. So it would be on that aspect.
So okay, thank you for your sharing. But my opinion, I think that the effort is very important for to have the indigenous people before they get the development project like land acquisition or economic acquisition or them project. It is very important for the indigenous people who live in the wildlife sanctuary or near the Mekong River. It is very important for all of the people to stay around. Thank you.
Thank you, Panhangan. Sorry, from what organization are you?
My name is Ngan Panya. I'm from that mission, Cambodia.
Dan Mission. Okay.
Yes.
Thanks for joining.
Okay. Thank you.
One super last question from Judy Sai.
Okay.
Forum.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much for giving me the chance. I just give a short notice that as the principle of effect has been adopted in the UN trip in 2007 and 2017. But can you share us that what are the best practice in Asia country of the effect principle apply? Because in Cambodia we found it was very concerned and very sensitive because the problem is the last word is consent that we cannot find in the country, so that the application of the principle of effect is quite challenging. And the second, is it possible to change the consent to the consultation? It still affect, but it just pre-prior and informed consultation. It likely to be worked in Cambodia, but I don't know if it is a concern to the international instrument that already adopted as a pre-prior and informed concerns. Thank you.
Thank you for that very good question. And yes, so on the first part, I fail to emphasize that consultation is also a way, is a start of discussing having a consent process. In Mekong, there are already processes of full and effective participation that can be equated to engaged consultation. And as I said earlier, sometimes we just have to be what do you call this, accepting of certain words in terms of where we are now, because it's the consent FPIC in other countries evolved through decades, and it started with recognition of the existence of indigenous people, recognition then again that of their right to be consulted for any development in their area, and then it started with consultation and then progressing towards more meaningful consultation. So sometimes we don't have to be bogged down by the term consent. I think in Cambodia, there is already a process of getting consultation. And I think even in Vietnam, it will be evolving into a consent process later on. But the question would be also, who would say at the national level that this consultation can be considered now consent, right? So that is still to be determined, but the cases of documenting consultation is important across forest dependent communities, and we should not stop by there. So meaning as we evolve and more instances of consultation is documented and is happening over time, I think we can find a solution wherein we can say, oh, this is already at the level of FPIC. I hope I answered that in a way that is useful with the information we have now.
Yeah, and then maybe I think some ongoing practices will be tackled in the part 2 of this learning session, and
Yes.
other safeguards. Because
Thank you. Nazar, can I have one more short question?
okay, go ahead.
I experienced working on this principle, but I still have a doubt that mostly the effect is applied only for indigenous people in the remote area. But for my perspective, I think principle of effect could not apply only for the indigenous people. It should be applied to all local people who are living nearby or in the protected areas or in the forest area. I don't know if some country, but in Cambodia, non-indigenous people also living in the protected area as well. So if the principle is applied only the indigenous people, the non-indigenous people may be affected, suffer from the project development without their consultation. Thank you.
Yes, that's a very important observation. And I think as the process for regional FPIC toolbox or a regional FPIC guidelines connected to tenure, that is already being discussed, and good to have that again as a reminder to everyone. And but I think very important also to note that FPIC was pushed and coined specifically in the context of indigenous people, and sometimes we have to understand that the context. But definitely, yes, FPIC should be the standard of consent, the standard of any agreement with for resources affecting communities, whether that is indigenous people or not.
All right. On that note, thank you, Miss Edna. I think we are already over time, and I'm very happy with what the question and answer and the discussion is very rich. But unfortunately, we have to end the session this afternoon. But again, I would like to thank Miss Edna, Attorney Edna Magigad, for her time, and we know she's very, very busy, but she still allowed us to invite her to share her knowledge and expertise on free, prior, and informed consent. And I would like to thank also all of you who were able to join this afternoon's learning session. We will be having another, the part 2 of the learning session on FPIC and Safeguards this coming March. We will share with you the details in the coming weeks. But for now, thank you, Ms. Edna, again for sharing with us the origins of FPIC, what's the benefit for applying FPIC, and unpacking one by one the definition of free, what is free, prior and informed, and consent, and also the important questions that we need to ask when we are discussing or reflecting on FPIC, and also the challenges you mentioned. There's lots of challenges, and there's also even a bad case of FPIC. But hopefully in the next session, in the next learning session, we get to see also other forms of safeguards other than FPIC also, and what are the good practices or what are the ongoing initiatives that promotes FPIC. Maybe just one last request for everyone here to turn on their videos if possible, so we can get a group photo. Again, thank you for all the questions. Those are very insightful also. And Ms. Edna, thank you for
sorry, I will become more prepared with the cases that Fem was asking.
No, it's okay. That's okay. It's for the
I will look into the cases of FPIC in the region.